serious sailors, seamen and overall people who spend a vast amount of time in the ocean. Have you ever witnessed something you would catalog as supernatural or unusual? What was it like? Spent a lot of time sailing commercially in the Irish Sea. On night watch you are always acutely aware of everything around you due to the silence and darkness. Some of the sounds you hear are deeply unsettling. I remember on a perfectly still night just hearing a gentle knocking noise coming from what seemed like the outside of the hull at the waterline. No idea what it was, but it freaked me out all shift. Distress flares in the middle of the Indian Ocean sailing Nigeria-Japan at night when I was a third mate. Looked less than 4 miles away. Altered course to it. Called the old man. Found nothing and no one over the course of 2 hours. I was the only one to see it. And I know what I saw. My watchman was down closing cabin shades. I understand why we had to move on. Keeps me up some nights though. Did we come so close to saving someone's life and just leave them there, alone in the ocean? No food or water. Did someone think they were rescued, but we ended up too far from them? Should we have waited until daytime? Did I just hallucinate? Granddad was a chief in the Navy. Dad is a merchant marine. I'm a sailor right after my first tour. Me and Granddad are both medical, so we have some ghost stories. One of his stories was a case of mass somnambulism sleepwalking on the US Roosevelt that he documented, but was never publicly addressed or explained back in the 60s. Sleepwalking is dangerous, not only because of the risks of injury, but because of the implications of underlying issues like night seizures or sleep apnea. A few dozen people sleepwalking a month is not unheard of on a carrier, but apparently in a 3-month period there was over 400 plus individual cases from over 100 sailors, from lower enlisted to senior officers, that were reported independently. These people came from all over the carrier, and he said he couldn't find any link to them. He was tasked with recording, but was never briefed on why it was happening, what caused it, or why it stopped. It was just dropped. Our speculation is drugs, or government testing, but we'll never know for sure. That's one of my granddad's stories. One of mine was on a smaller ship that was getting rough turbulence while underway in the Pacific. I swear we went into some kinda Bermuda Triangle shit, because we got into this super calm part. I'm assuming the Eye of Awesome shit. I'm not a meteorologist, and it felt like an out-of-body experience. Like the world paused and everything kinda became quiet and ringing like tinnitus for what felt like at least half an hour. And then suddenly it all came flooding back, like being forced back into my body and being aware. It was still calm at that point, and we'd only felt the calm for maybe a few minutes. But I talked to some of my guys afterwards, and they felt something similar. At the calm point, some said they felt high. I wouldn't know about it. One of our lieutenants said he felt like he passed out and woke up like sleepwalking. It was a surreal shared experience. Doc on the ship, our corpsman chief, said it was probably some pressure drop that made us feel disoriented though, but we still joke we all got abducted for a minute and returned. Edito and my dad said he and his shipmates saw dancing women on top of the waves all the time. NMB not me, but my friend's dad is an old like 30 or 40 year US Navy vet. No nonsense kind of guy. Many years ago he was on a ship, and he got a call a sailor was freaking out and trying to jump from the ship. He was crying and saying he needed to get to his mother. Not long after getting the guy calmed and into the medical area, they received message the sailor's mother had died that night. Sailed on TAL ships for a good while, among other things. Saw some green flashes, a moonbow, lots of phosphorescence, big whales, street almost fire on our mast steel ship this time. But the only creepy story was at port. The only person who had ever died on the ship was over 100 years ago, and he fell from the rigging. Went splat. One of the crew was up furling sails, and was about to step out onto the foot rope that runs along the yard. He said he got an overwhelming urge to not step on it, and felt a tug on his harness keeping him from stepping out. He was so freaked out he kept the other 2 guys behind him from getting on the line as well. The other guys started getting a really bad feeling too, and they decided to check out the foot rope. It had been really degrading on the inside. Even through the outside looked mostly fine. The line probably would have snapped as they climbed out there. and they would have fallen, as you are pretty much free climbing until you get to a stopping point. A maelstrom in Norway. It's actually really fascinating. But looking down into the currents, it's a bit freaky. Look it up, it's like a load of whirlpools all happening together. Alaska salmon fisherman here. Last summer my crew member and I were both falling asleep on a perfectly calm night when the whole boat started violently shaking. I wasn't sure if a tree had surfaced and punched through the hull, if we were somehow hitting bottom, etc until we both storm out to the back deck in our underwear to jump in the skiff. Then, in the 10:30 p.m. sunset, we witnessed the cliffs around us shed layers of house-sized boulders with dust plumes hundreds of feet into the air. It was deafening. Turns out it was a 7.8 earthquake. Luckily that tsunami was very small. But I've never been in a tsunami. My crew member was posted up on the stern and me at the helm, scouring the horizon, so we could motor into the wave of a lifetime. The ocean water was so still. It appeared that we were sailing on glass, not one ripple. I have never seen this again. In the Gulf of Aden, having been at sea for a while, and with absolutely blistering heat, I heard my nickname called 3 times. Clearly and loudly. It was my first time with this particular crew and none of them knew my nickname. My best guess is dehydration and stress, but I'll never forget it. The closest to supernatural, or at least something I can't explain, happened halfway between Cornwall and the Scillies. We were sailing in a fresh breeze. 5-6 foot swells maybe. That's perfectly fine sailing weather, but the boat will rock, and there will be quite a bit of noise from the wind, the sails and waves. So we sail happy along when suddenly the sea is perfectly flat, and everything is quiet, like somebody turned the sound off. I look around, and the water is pitch dark. It only lasted for a minute, and then everything was back to normal, but I got a really eerie feeling. Flew helicopters in the Navy for a few years. On my first deployment to Southeast Asia, I was flying over the Sea of Japan and saw a large pulsing aura of red light far enough below the surface I could not make out a source. We were 30-ish miles from shore and had not been briefed on any assets in the area that might make something like that make sense. No erroneous indications on instruments or radio chatter, just slow steady pulsing red light. We saw it, circled it a few times, made a note of the time and location we encountered it, and my crew chief asked if I wouldn't mind getting the heck out of there. So we finished our transit, and I made a note of everything in my debrief. I passed it up the chain of command, but they basically wrote it off as some sort of visual phenomenon we had from a long day of flying in dry suits. It's always been hard to imagine our entire crew hallucinating the same thing. Edit: I didn't think this would blow up, but I appreciate all the input, as some of you have suggested possible submerged man-made objects like buoys. I would say this is unlikely due to the sheer size of what we saw. Underwater volcanic activity, as some of you suggest, actually makes a lot of sense. The light was probably 50 meters across and very bright. Those of you that suggested volcanic activity, I would like to ask if it would have something like a rhythm to it. The light would slowly brighten for about 3 seconds, dim for the same amount of time, then remain completely off for the same amount of time. If anyone knows, I'd appreciate it, and I could pass it to some of the guys that were on that crew and maybe put some dudes at ease. I was on navigation watch with the second mate one night off the Philippines. The ship was on autopilot making for Manila. It was a clear, still, dark night. Through the binoculars I picked up navigation lights of another ship about 5 degrees off the port bow. It was well off, but I noted the bearing and checked the radar. Nothing. This was not unusual. If it was one of the small local fishing vessels, they can be hard to pick up. On the other hand, they usually don't bother with navigation lights either. Quickish technical detail. Skip: if familiar with the purpose and function of nav lights, navigation lights on a vessel are baffled so they can only be seen from a certain direction. Looking at a boat dead ahead, coming toward you, you will see a red light to the right of a green light. This is what I could see. If the boat turns to their right or starboard, the two lights will begin to move together, and the green light will fade from view because of the baffles that are around it. As the turn continues you will be able to see the red port their left side light only. And a bit later the white stern light will appear as the red fades behind its baffles. This way, you can tell in an instant the orientation of another vessel in the dark. 10 minutes passed, and I checked the bearing again. Still 5 degrees off the port bow. Red and green visible. I checked the radar again. Still nothing. I alerted the second mate. 5 minutes later. Nothing changed. Nothing on radar. We were on a collision bearing with an invisible vessel that was steadily getting closer. As a precaution we switched back to manual steering, and I took the helm. By now I could make out the lights without the binoculars. Still coming directly at us. We were on the point of taking evasive measures when suddenly the lights started moving together. We assumed that the other vessel had finally spotted us and was turning away to their right. I was expecting the red light to fade from view, except it didn't. The two lights simply swapped position. The red went to the left and the green went to the right. They remained 5 degrees off the port bow, and then they moved back again. Still, nothing on radar, nothing through the binoculars. We eventually passed the lights within 20 meters. From the wing of the bridge I could see with perfect clarity straight down at it. Whatever it was, there was nothing to see except the two lights, one red and one green, floating freely in air about 10 feet above the ocean, reflecting back off the waves, gently and occasionally swapping positions in the night. Edit: this happened about 40 years ago. Totally forgot I was so old, lol. So, no, not drones. I did think maybe boys at the time, but the lights weren't bobbing around with the waves as they would if they were supported on rods, which were also not visible. Have you ever seen 30, 40 as best as I could determine humpback whales feeding together? I know this isn't supernatural, but one whale is so seldom seen by people, let alone 30 scooping up krill at the same time. I'll never forget that. When I was roving patrol on a submarine I always thought I saw someone walking parallel to me down missile compartment upper level. If I was on the port side then I saw them on the starboard side and vice versa. I always chalked it up to pipes and valves creating weird shadows. Additionally, it felt heavy on that level, like there was some sort of presence, the feeling you get when someone's watching you. I never told anyone. Then one day a few weeks into patrol, one of the other rovers asked me if it felt weird up there. He specifically said that he saw someone up there too, just like I had. We shared stories and then talked to the third rover, and he said I only go up there to do my rounds every hour then get the duck out of that haunted level. I crewed on a TAL ship and we were anchored with a bunch of others in a harbor. We had to take shifts at night because it was an old boat and did weird things. I was on shift in the little steering cabin when I heard someone running around the deck. I thought it was one of the other crew, so I poked my head out and told them to knock it off. They kept running and I was afraid they'd slip, so I followed them. We went around the whole ship twice before I caught up with a shapeless shadow which stopped and flew directly up into the air. Convinced it was a prank I walked back to the end of the boat when I saw we had drifted on anchor and were almost under the bow of a much larger ship. I called the rest of the crew and we sorted it out. But I might not have noticed until too late if it weren't for the weird shadow. I only worked as a walk-on, walk-off cabin attendant, but the old sea dogs always had far-fetched stories to tell. The engineer teaching us about watertight doors told us a story that happened to him on another ship that the same company used to own, but was decommissioned and scraped in 2011. Thesis: watertight doors separate the different bulkheads underwater compartments that stop the whole ship from sinking. If there is a hole in the hull, think about the metal doors that slid down in the engine room of the Titanic. These doors are always closed. To get from compartment to compartment there was a lever that you pulled and the door opened. You stepped through. Then as soon as you let go of the lever, the door would close. For the safety of the ship it would close tight shut, even if there was a person blocking it. On this older ship there was an engineer who tripped and was crushed to death in one of these doors. Years later this engineer who told me the story tripped and fell on that same door and was about to be crushed to death in the same way. But just before killing him, it stopped and opened again, despite no one being around and nothing touching the lever. And before anyone says that there must have been some safety thing installed, No, as I said before, the one job of these doors is to close no matter what, or who is in the way. Consider subscribing if you enjoyed this video, and if you want to see more of Reddit universe.